Because I made up a title, Computational Book Studies, does not mean that this thing exists. It's just a title. So we have to discuss whether this thing should be or become alive. Because using number crunching in culture is somehow irritating. For example, for the Scottish writer A.L. Kennedy, is doing art history or computational literary studies, something like hitting a painting with a fish. And this is obviously not a good way to deal with paintings, for example, because it's very simple. It's only number crunching and some statistical analysis in the end. There's no real outcome except of something like sausage stuffing, and somehow it's unhealthy to do. Well, this is one perspective, because using the computers in the humanities is somehow irritating, obviously. But there's a longer tradition to look into numbers dealing with, for example, poetry. And here's one example, an American scholar, Josephine Miles. She started in the 30s and early 40s to understand the English writers like Wordsworth, John Dryden and others. And her approach was very much somehow counting words, to put it very simply. Because we all use words in a specific manner, we use some word classes more than others, and forensic linguists could show that if you every one of us has a certain style how he or she uses words. And what she has done is starting to look into these numbers, specifically see how words are combinated, so what's the concordance between the words, the keywords in context, as it's called today. And she already started using the computer in the 40s. And in the 40s there were not many people who know that computers exist. So there is a tradition, and you can go even further back and, for example, discussing who wrote the plays of Shakespeare or the works of Shakespeare, the Earl of Oxford or Francis Bacon and others. And mathematicians like Thomas Corwin Mendenhall, an American mathematicians in the 19th century, for example, think, okay, we can try to get us a certain profile of styles of writers. If we look at the words according to their lengths, because some use bigger words, smaller words, the frequency of words we use is a little bit different, and we can also look into the syllables of words, the number of words in sentence and stuff like that. And so everybody of us gets a certain profile of that. And then he compared Francis Bacon with Shakespeare and others. So to sum up this approach, which is not directly connected with the computer, it's older, I want to phrase it as what I call the Morelli's methods. It's not only because we are in Italy, but it's a good place to be in Italy, because Giovanni Morelli is a very famous name in the political history of the 19th century in Italy, in the Risorgimento. He was also a great physician, and he was an art historian. And interestingly, you know, art history pop up because rich people, like in Britain and other places, they want to buy artworks, and they send people to Italy. The people are not stupid. They said, oh yes, it's a Tizian. Yeah, okay, so it's a little bit more expensive, but it's a Tizian. How do you really know whether this is a Tizian or a Raphael or something like that? And out of these reasons, Fiorelli and others started this field we call today art history. Giovanni Morelli was one of them. He wrote in German, but pretended to be a translation from Russian under the name Ivan Lermolyev, which is an anagram, very interesting thing. And the method he used is interesting because he's not looking in, wow, the big picture, you see the color, I feel it must be Tizian. No, he said, let's look how the ears are painted, or fingers, because to paint fingers is really difficult. So the little details, like the little words, if I would ask you how many definite articles are you using in comparison to undefined articles, you normally couldn't answer a question like this. But everybody of us has a little difference in these styles. And that's the same is true in art history. So looking at these little details which you can somehow count is what make Morelli famous in many his methodological debates. So in that sense, we can talk with Jakob Grimm that the exact humanities is not a contradiction. And Jakob Grimm thought about this heavily. And I think we have pretty much opportunities to use the computer if we want to look at the little details or the big numbers, but big numbers are in the end built out of very little details, as we have seen by the talks already this morning. In contrast to what most people think, you need to know the area. It makes no sense if you have no idea where Dryden was, what's the style of writing at that time. It doesn't make sense to count adjectives. If you don't have an idea about different sorts of catalogs, so in the case of metadata, it's very obvious you can't make any sense out of it. However, computational insights do not make sense if you want to understand a single author, because you can read it. You can maybe read 50 books. During our lifetime, we are able maybe to read something like 4,000 books if we invest a lot of time, like Umberto Eco, in reading books, but not 5,000 or your numbers, 4,600 books. There, the computer came into the game. So to understand large numbers is helpful to see patterns and principles which are hard to see by the naked eyes. Specifically, if we want to understand larger patterns in the cultural evolution, if we want to understand the changes in typography over, let's say, 500 years or something like this. So I think we are in a lucky position because, as many of your talks showed, we have a strong tradition in counting books, bibliographies, catalogs. We love this. And this is a great opportunity because not everybody in cultural studies love counting stuff, but we love to count, as we just heard by John and others here. There's a great debate. I just mentioned two very famous books about this, what counting means, by Roger Chartier or Don McKinsey. So we have a very reflected way to handle numbers. And they're pretty out big catalogs, meta-catalogs, knowledge, but often this knowledge is just printed. And it's hard to extract knowledge out of these catalogs. And this is even if you look into data, like in the German tradition, the VD16, VD17, 18, for example, they are so differently done. The structure is so differently done. That is really hard to look over VD16 to VD17 because the rules are so different. And if you look in the English or French or Spanish, other tradition, it's always the same problem. So what we lack is reliable data, and that is where your project come into it, or many of your projects, because you are all experts. You know your data, really the single data and the big picture also, and to have reliable data and is very unknown. So I had a new colleague now coming from the computer science department of the Max Planck Institute, and he said, you in the humanities, you have no data. We in biology, we share data at a global scale about COVID-19 or something. This is what we do every day. Why are you not doing this? Okay, I said, yes, let's do it. We try to collect data. often we have the problem, and this was mentioned by some of your talks, we do not know the population in statistical terms. So you have a sample, but you do not know the population, so you do not the exact relation, and there's also expertise necessary to understand whether this sample somehow represents, is a balanced corpus out of the historical population, or whether we have no clue about it. There's a lot of statistical methods into it to deal with this problem, but we have to be aware of that. So I show you briefly some examples. It's not about specifically book history, just to give you a flavor, finally. So you might be, many of us use these bar charts. This is one example by Nicolas Page in French first-person novels, for example. And looking into the genres, the distribution over time, we are very good in doing this. And normally it stops there. Your project already mentioned this by the talk of Gerhard, for example, looking in compare prices with inflations and other areas. And this is an example by Alan Riddle and his group where he tries to calculate the novel production on the British Isles and Ireland, but in correlation with the changing population. And there we have a major problem. We should talk maybe later on. What is correlated with what? So we can explore many dimensions, but we need, is the population a factor influencing the number of novel production, yes or no? Because the market has grown, yes or no? Anything like this is a statistical assumption we made because we think two dimensions are somehow correlated, and correlated is not causality, as we all know. We try, for example, we try to extract from Wright Library. This is the largest collection, bibliography of American literature from the 18th century, when something like American literature emerged. But it's hard to say when does it really emerge, when it's different to the English literature. But only parts of these volumes are accessible. We have more than 50,000 works. We can easily visualize the cities as too small. I'm sorry, but New York is the largest place where most of the books are printed, and then we can see how the distribution over time is, whether it goes to Western, how many female writers are published in which publishing house, because the publishing houses is also named here, so we know who publishing which books in which places. And of course, we all mentioned this already, to use maps is very nice. You can put time sliders below and then see over time how things are changing. Sorry, it's very small. You can choose the gender and or other groups becoming part of the American literature, like people from other backgrounds than English backgrounds, for example, stuff like that. And always you need to know, is this a factor? Is gender an interesting factor to be correlated with a place and a publishing house and so on? So, but this is possible to correlate, and to give you a complete different example, it has nothing to do with book history in its specific value. It's about Hermann Hesse's works. So we go into details of motives and moods used in his poems. And just to give you an example how we can connect many factors in different visualizations. So just look in the visualization, and visualization is always a technique to say, to analyze something. So we can look into certain words used and how these words are used to elicit certain moods, for example. You can choose the threshold, how many words are necessary to do this. You can look into directly from the words down to the specific poems, for example. You can use time lines, so different parts of his work, biography, to put some statistic on it, and so on. So it's possible to really do very elaborate visualization, but that needs definitely to think first which factor correlates with what. The visualization is not the problem, the core of it is the correlation of factors. So to come to an end, I made a structural model just up. That's completely nonsense, of course. But this gives you an example, as we do normally in statistical analysis. We think about how does the language influence the price per copy, for example, at which factor, 0.4 or 0.3? Well, there are some methods to calculate. So what we need to do, and many of us already do this, is we build corpora, which is more than collections. Corpora are balanced, they are representative. You know, they represent a certain historical epoch, time scale, whatever. So this is possible to do. But there are big data out, like OCLC data. We collected, for example, children books and thought about, oh yes, we can see what are the children books collected worldwide, because OCLC. And it turns out that data are complete mess. We can talk about the American library market, not market libraries, which books, but it doesn't tell anything about most of the European countries, for example. So because the structure and the use of these catalog data are so differently, Dewey classification is not constantly used if we compare Italy with German or France or whatever. So there's many problems. And for today, book historians, we have a complete new situation. We have real-time data. So Tolino, Netflix, Wattpad, Goodreads, Amazon, they know what the world is reading. So there are numbers out, not easy to get. We try to get some of those numbers, but we can somehow maybe trace what people are interested today. We need an expert knowledge about the metadata, about structure of catalogs, how data are collected, as we have seen, but also about the details of the data. We can use maps, trees, graphs, any kinds of statistics. I point specifically to structural models because this is in the core, understand how we think data are connected with one another. There are plenty of opportunities to visualize, even very elaborate the data, but this is part of the analysis. This is not just making fun and nice pictures or something like this. And of course, what we need is an infrastructure for these data, at least for a community like book historians. And this would not only include the data, it would include the software, the kind of database software you're using, because in 5 years there will be a different world. The analysis, we need DOEs, so object identifiers. If you want to point to John data specifically, there must be the data, and we normally use them by Zenodo, which is given by physicists, because we haven't built a known infrastructure in the humanities, at least in most European countries. And therefore we are actually dealing, and some are already talking about, know about this. We are talking about whether we should build a sort of a portal where we start with the VD16, together with libraries, bunch of colleagues here. And a portal is not a database, it's collecting different database, and the main purpose is to make these data map to one another, because often the data are in silos. It's really hard to compare the data, like money, how costly are a certain copy, something like that. And to map these things is a huge task. So we are actually working on that with a number of colleagues, maybe starting simply with the German collection, because we get the money from the German research organizations, but we would be definitely open to include anything related to this topic. So that's my talk. Thank you very much.